The late American theologian Robert McAfee Brown was involved in a study group at his church back in the 1980s at First Presbyterian Church of Palo Alto. That's on the San Francisco Peninsula. In fact, I went to high school just a few blocks away from that church. At the time, I didn't know really what was going on there. I was involved in a different church and a different denomination at the time. But the group that Robert McAfee Brown was meeting with was looking at the refugee crisis from Central America at the time. And for actually a couple years, they met, I think every week, but several times a month, just to look at the issues and to learn the best they could from what was going on, and then to ask themselves, what should we be doing as a church about this? And so as they met, they looked at all kinds of data. They looked at what people were doing and different issues, and they learned about stories of people as well. And one of the stories was about a young lady by the name of Maria. She was Salvadoran and lived in a little village in El Salvador where death squads came through on a regular basis and killed people who disagreed with the government, even slightly. And Maria didn't think she had to do anything, or she hadn't done anything to worry about, but one of the things that she was passionate about was feeding hungry children. And so she actually, in her little village, had a soup kitchen for the children of the community and others that might be passing through. So she had her soup kitchen, and she thought, this is my way of helping. However, the government didn't like the fact that she was running a soup kitchen for children, and they labeled her a communist, and one day she found out that she was on their hit list and knew that any day she would be shot. So she immediately went into hiding for her great crime of feeding hungry children, and in the dark of night, she traveled out away from her village and went all through the rest of El Salvador, traveling at night under darkness and hiding inside buildings and churches as much as she could during the day. She made it all the way through El Salvador, all the way through Guatemala, all the way through the country of Mexico, and all in all, she traveled on foot mostly, almost 3,000 miles on her roundabout way to the U.S. border. And the reason she went there is she had heard about the 1980 Refugee Act, which pretty much guaranteed admission to people who were fleeing their country because of almost certain persecution for religious or political reasons. Well, she applied to enter the United States, and like 95% or so of the people that were applying, she was denied entry into the United States. She looked at her options, and she knew if she went back to El Salvador, she would be killed instantly. She knew if she stayed in Mexico, they would send her back to El Salvador, and she would be killed instantly. And so she did what I think most of us would do. She crossed the border illegally, just praying that she wouldn't get caught, every day praying and hoping that there would be some people that would help her. And once she got across the border, she ran into somebody that was involved in a nationwide program where churches were housing refugees and helping them to stay alive. Because like Robert McAfee Brown and his group, they were learning that people were being killed for doing such horrendous things as feeding hungry children. Well, Robert McAfee Brown and his group were learning about the plight of Maria and many like her, and they decided that they were going to be like many of those other churches and become an official sanctuary church. And they looked at issues like politics, morality, patriotism, ethics. And as they were looking at all this stuff and discussing it on a weekly basis or so, they were also asking themselves, when is it okay as a Christian to break the law? And one of the items of conversation, one of the topics that came up was the comparisons between the refugee crisis of the 1980s and the refugee crisis of Jews in the 1930s and 40s in Europe. And the question that was asked to them, which they addressed, was, if a Jew came to your door and said, the Nazis are after me and they're going to kill me for being Jewish, what would you do? And immediately everyone knew, well, we would say, come on in, we'll protect you, we'll hide you, we'll do whatever it takes because what's happening out there is wrong. And they knew at that point that they were going to become a sanctuary church. And so they went to their session in the Presbyterian church, that's the governing body of the local church, and they basically presented all that, and the session virtually unanimously just said, we are going to become a sanctuary church. And that week, 4 young Salvadoran men ended up coming to their church, and they were living in the church parlor. And what was really interesting for the people of the church, they were doing this with a lot of fear. They knew they were breaking the law. They also knew that they didn't know what was going to happen. And they didn't really know these young men that were coming until they got there. But what was really interesting, when those young men came, they realized that they weren't just people out there with this label refugees, they were human beings. And as they heard the stories of these 4 young men, they were moved with compassion for them. They learned that one of them was at college, and all of his college friends were shot and killed by the government, and he knew that he was next. And so what did he do? He left. They also learned that another one, his wife and baby were shot and killed, and he was in his early 20s. I think the range of the group of the refugees was 19 to 23, but he knew that he was next, and so he left. Another of the young men knew that he was on the notorious hit list of the government, so he left. But every one of those 4 young men had these amazing stories to tell. And as people of the church sat down with them and heard their stories, they knew they were doing the right thing. And they knew that they had to keep doing that. No one ever got arrested. But those 4 young men lived because that church was willing to step out in faith with compassion to help when no one else was out there to help. They also learned that these 4 young men had names and families. And a lot of them did have families, but they were all killed. And they knew these young men by Alvaro, Jose, Oscar, Salvador, and they became part of their church family. The study group in 1980 in Palo Alto learned that there were something like 70,000 Salvadorans alone that were being murdered by their government and guerrillas, and most of the people that left had no other options. And so they just knew that this was the right thing to do for them. In this morning's gospel lesson, we heard the words of Jesus, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." And the word righteousness comes from the Greek word dikaiosune, which really means justice as well as righteousness. And it has a whole range of nuances and meanings behind it. It doesn't just mean righteousness in terms of doing what's right and proper and legal. It's much like the Hawaiian word pono, which many of you know in our state motto, "Ua mau ke ea o ka aina I ka pono," the life of the land is perpetuated in righteousness. Well, that was a word that was given primarily by Christians, righteousness, because that was the best translation they knew of in terms of the word pono. But pono means so much more than just righteousness as we think about it. It means justice. It means doing the right thing. It also means being in right relationships with the people around you and with God. It also means, more or less, being who you are and allowing other things to be, or other people to be who they are and other things to be what they are. So pono has a lot of meanings packed into it. I think in one of the Hawaiian dictionaries, there's actually 83 definitions for pono because it means so much. It's such a rich word, but it's the same for that word that's translated righteousness that Jesus was talking about when he said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." Jesus also said, "For they will be filled." And as I was reading the words this week and also reading about the refugee crisis that is in the world today and the refugee crises that have been going on for many, many years, decades, centuries, and millennia, I started thinking about what it is that we ought to do as individuals and as churches. Because you can't listen to the news these days and not hear about the refugee crisis. It was even in the Garden Island this week about what the ban that our president has placed on many people from mostly Muslim countries. And we've also learned, I think it was yesterday's paper or the day before, that there are people on the mainland that aren't coming to Hawaii anymore because Hawaii is a state that has said that just doesn't seem like the right thing to do. So as I was thinking about all of this, I started asking, what is it that we can do? What are some of the things that we can agree on, and maybe some things we disagree on as well? But I was looking at the scriptures thinking, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And today is the fourth Sunday that we're actually looking at the Beatitudes. And so in the last 3 weeks, we've been looking at blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And as I was looking at these words and at the sermons for the last few weeks and our discussion time on Wednesday nights, it occurred to me that the refugees of the world are those that Jesus was talking about. For they are the ones that are mourning. They are the poor in spirit. They are the meek. They're the ones that are hungering and thirsting for righteousness and for justice. The first gospel lesson that Angela read for us from Matthew 25, Jesus is actually saying, when you help the least of these, you're helping me. When you give bread to someone, you're giving bread to me. When you give water to a thirsty person, you're giving water to me. When you visit and welcome the stranger, you're visiting and welcoming me. And I could only think that Jesus may have been thinking about his own refugee problem when he was a little boy and Mary and Joseph and Jesus had to flee the Middle East and ended up in North Africa just to stay alive. And I think Jesus knew that refugees are the least of these, and Jesus is saying, when you help them, you're helping me. And luckily, somebody was there to help Jesus and Mary and Joseph all those many years ago. It's important for us to know that when we're helping the least of these, we're helping Jesus. And I know that Jesus didn't mean that there's some people who have less value than others. He was referring to what the world says about people. It's the people that aren't in the middle of where the power is, and they're not in the center of the decision-making bodies or the politicians or where the wealthy people are. The least of these are the people that the world considers those people out on the margins that don't matter. And Jesus, by saying, blessed are they, he's saying they matter just as much as anybody else. So after thinking about all these things this week, I decided to do a little research on refugees myself. And so I started on the United Nations Refugee website. And I was amazed at how many refugees there are right now. Some 5 million in the world that are displaced from Syria alone. And if you look at the people from Sudan and Yemen and Somalia and so many other places, there are literally millions of people in the same situation that are so vulnerable that are the least of these that Jesus was talking about. And I, of course, was reading about different opinions and knowing that there's a lot of people that believe all different kinds of things about what we should do about it. I know that we all want to do something. And so yesterday and this morning even, I was still thinking about what are the things that I'm pretty sure we all agree on. And number one, I know that we all agree that we should pray for refugees. We should also pray for our involvement in helping them in one way or another, whatever that might be. But it's really important that we pray because as Christians and people of faith, that's what we do. So I hope you'll join me in praying for refugees and for world leaders that would have compassion for them. And if there's ever any opportunity for us as a church to help in any way that we can, that we would as well. I've also noticed during this last week, as I've been reading stories about refugees, that my heart has been doing something quite different than just listening or reading about the data and the facts. Let me give you an example. Ahmed was a man that lived in Syria not too long ago, just a couple years ago. And because of things that were happening in his government and the opposition, and he found himself in the midst of the civil war and really didn't, as far as I could tell from reading, have any opinion one way or another. He just was afraid for his life and the life of his family members. And so he decided to talk to his family and gather all the money that they could possibly gather together. And there were 8 others. So he had a wife, children, grandchildren. And he said, if we stay here, we're going to die. Let's just get all of our money together and figure out how to get out of here so that we can at least live. We don't know where we're going to go, but we know that there's other options. And so they gathered all their money together, and they paid for refugee smugglers to get them out of Syria, and they ended up in Libya because they had heard if they could get to Libya, there were people that would take them on a boat to Malta. And from Malta, they could get to safety somehow. And so they got to Libya, and to their great surprise, they were locked up in a stable on a farm. And the people that were in charge told them that we can't put you on a boat until we have enough people that can fill the boat up. So you're just going to have to stay in there. So they locked the door of the stable, and they were trapped in there day after day after day after day. And as more people started showing up, they finally were told by their captors, well, we have enough people. You can go now. However, for all this unanticipated rent and food that we've given you, which is practically nothing, that's going to be another $3,000 a person. Well, that was pretty much all the money they had. But what option, what other choice did they have? So they got all their money together and gave $3,000 a person for all 9 of them, got on the boat. And little did they know, this wasn't really a seaworthy boat, and it was kind of floating off towards Malta. And when they looked behind them, they realized that their captors, the refugee smugglers, were following them. And then just out of the blue, the smugglers got out their rifles and started shooting at the refugees. And they shot as many as they could, and they shot holes in the boat, and the boat sank. And for some unknown reason, Ahmed lived, even though hardly anybody else did. And he made it to Malta, but every single one of his family members died. Almost everybody on that little boat died. And he's sitting there in Malta with no money, with no family whatsoever, just wondering what's going to happen next and wondering if it's even worth living anymore. So as I read stories like this, I can't just sit back and say, well, it's somebody else's problem. And as I think about all the different things that I've been reading in the newspaper and hearing on the news and listening to people, it seems to me that there's 2 very distinct opinions that are far ends of the same spectrum, where one group of people will say, you know, it's just not our problem. There are refugees out there, but there's too many, and you know what? They're not our religion, and they might be dangerous, so let the rest of the world take care of them. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's people that want to have just about as many refugees as possible come. And my guess is as long as they're vetted, that, is a given. But I think most of us are probably somewhere in the middle. And I keep moving in this other direction the more I hear the stories of the refugees. And so I think it's really important that we pay attention, not just to what's being said about people, but to the people themselves. To listen to their stories, find out really what they've been through. Because when I read the story of Ahmed and so many others, I'm just moved with compassion, and I can't look at the Gospels the lessons that we were looking at today and just say, this has to be somebody else's problem. We have to do something. The other thing I invite you to do is on Wednesday nights, we have our discussion group where we look at the scripture from the previous Sunday and what was in the sermon and so on, and we talk about that and ask ourselves, well, what might this mean for us as a church? What are we moved to do? And what are we feeling God calling us to do? So Wednesday nights through Lent at 6 o'clock, I invite you to come. Even our first-time visitors, come join us and give us your input as well. And it's been really enjoyable for me, not only to talk about the topics that we're talking about in church, but also to get to know the members of the congregation and our visitors as well as we do that on Wednesday nights. So pray, listen to the stories, come on Wednesday night. But there's also something really important that we do every single year that is becoming more and more important to me this year than ever before. And that's the United Church of Christ One Great Hour of Sharing opportunity that we have, where every year, close to Easter, we give money to help people like refugees. And in the last 2 years alone, the United Church of Christ has given something like $4.5 million to help refugees and people suffering from natural disasters, people in crisis. And there's, I think, 7 or 8 other denominations that also contribute to One Great Hour of Sharing. And there are probably tens of millions of dollars that all of us have given together over the last half a decade or so. I think that One Great Hour of Sharing has always been important to us. But as I've been reading the stories of refugees over this last week, I've just thought the bit that I give to One Great Hour of Sharing every more just doesn't feel like enough. And so I'm actually going to give at least double this year what I gave last year. I thought that's one thing I can do to help the refugee crisis and help so many others. So the final thing I ask you to do is this year, when you consider what you might give to One Great Hour of Sharing, to consider a gift that's way beyond what you've done in the past if you're able to. Because I know that sometimes we give a little bit to One Great Hour of Sharing and know that it all adds up. But as I think about how frustrated I often am living on Kauai, thinking, I don't know of any Syrian refugees, I can't help them. But this is one way that I can help in a really significant way. On Maundy Thursday, or actually on Palm Sunday in 3 weeks, and then Maundy Thursday when we celebrate the Last Supper, and on Easter Sunday, we will collect the One Great Hour of Sharing offering here in church. And I invite you to give just beyond generously as you consider what you might give to One Great Hour of Sharing this year. Last year, I heard that this church gave so much money to the Christmas offering, which goes primarily to help ministers and retired clergy and church workers. Per capita, we were in the top 10 churches. This church, Koloa Union Church, per capita, we gave more than all the rest of the churches in the United States that are United Church of Christ, except for less than 10. And so I know that you're a generous congregation, and I know that you care about the world, and I know that you care about people like Ahmed, people like Maria, and millions of others. So I hope this year, and I invite you to make us one of the top 10 per capita givers for One Great Hour of Sharing as well.